And now I would like to introduce today's special guests. As Canadians, we can be proud of our public education system. It is one of the cornerstones of the stable, literate, and prosperous country we love. For our children, schools are a great gift, opening doors to new possibilities and brighter futures. Good public schools are something many Canadians take for granted. For immigrant parents, however, the quality of Canadian schools is one of the best reasons for coming here. Canada has always been a diverse nation. One of the roles of our schools has always been to provide the best possible education to our young within the context of this rich diversity. But our country is facing rapid changes to its demographic makeup. Our population is aging rapidly, threatening the tax base on which publicly funded education is built. At the same time, we face rising immigration levels, the growth in Aboriginal populations, and the decline in rural populations. All these factors place increasing demands on schools and educators. John F. Kennedy once famously said that children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future. As Don Drummond will tell you in a few minutes, whether we have children or not, we as a country cannot afford to let the quality of our educational system falter. To do so will significantly endanger Canada's economic health. To do so will leave pools of labour hopelessly underutilized in a country with growing labour shortages. It will also invite the social frustrations and discord we have seen in so many other countries around the globe. Since 1993, the Learning Partnership has been committed to championing a strong public education system. Partners in this effort include parents, educators, government, community, and corporate leaders who recognize the health of our schools are vital to our future. Demographic changes in Canada and their impact on public education is the title of the study released late last year by the Learning Partnership. It was prepared as the basis for roundtable discussions and public contribution in forums such as this. A final report will follow later this year in the hope of developing strategic policy options for governments, schools, and communities facing the demographic challenges that lie ahead. Veronica Lacey has headed up the Learning Partnership for the past 6 years, following a career in which she has worn the hat of teacher, principal, and of course, Ontario's Deputy Minister of Education and Training in the Mike Harris government. TD Bank Financial Group was the principal sponsor of the demographic study, and Senior Vice President and Chief Economist Don Drummond served as steering committee co-chair. Don has served as Federal Associate Deputy Minister of Finance and now leads TD's economics work in analyzing and forecasting economic performance in Canada and abroad. Together, Veronica and Don will discuss education and prosperity, what the changing face of Canada's classrooms tell us about our future well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, as I turn things over to our very capable moderator, Amanda Lang, please join me in welcoming today's special guests, Veronica Lacey and Don Drummond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noella. I'm delighted to be here. As a journalist, I get to learn for a living, which is surely the best thing about being a journalist. And there was a lot about this subject that I didn't know. Obviously, it's lots that I still have to learn. Veronica, I want to start. I mean, the name of the study that they published is evidence you're not trying to sell us anything. It's not a catchy name. Study on demographic changes in Canada and their impact on public education. You're taking that now out into a consultation process. You're partway through it across the country, C to C to C, as they say. So why don't we start with what that's about, why you're doing it?
Okay. The whole study, which is actually quite exhaustive, it's over 150 pages, and it was authored by Dr. René Houle from UNB and Dr. Ted Harvey from the University of Toronto, as you said, is an analysis not only of the current landscape of the student population in Canada, but of the future impact of the demographic changes. And we chose specifically 3 lenses through which we analyze this situation. One is the immigrant and Aboriginal community, the immigrant and refugee community, the Aboriginal community, and the rural depopulation. So the study, as I said, is very extensive. It's sponsored by the TD Bank, by the Canadian Council on Learning, and the McCain Foundation, and essentially fits very well with the mission of the Learning Partnership, which, as you heard Noella say, is to champion a strong publicly funded education system as a cornerstone of a civil and prosperous society. We've always had changes. And in fact, the last 15 to 20 years, we and principals in this room will attest to the tremendous changes, but it is nothing compared to what is coming down. And our understanding of what changes are taking place is really key to our maintaining a prosperous society, but also a socially cohesive society. If we don't get it, our kids are not going to meet in the only place where cultures, religions, languages, races meet. It's our public schools. Nor will they learn to be a Canadian. Where else do you learn to be a Canadian except in a Canadian classroom?
Now, we're sitting here with one of the country's top economists, and it does raise the obvious question, which is why, on a personal level, you may care a great deal, but why, on a professional level, are you here?
Well, the first reason on a professional level is that TD Bank won't let the Economist touch the real money, so there's so I'm somewhat limited in what I can do. So this was an area that was open to me. Beyond that, though, my obsession, and it's been going on for about 20 years right now, is to understand why Canada's standard of living is not rising. Sometimes I think I'm about the only one that cares about that, where all surveys of people's views of the economy all seem to be very positive, but our standard of living, if you look at income per person, has basically been going nowhere for about 15 years right now. And as the population ages, I think that'll become more of a burning issue. So I'm always looking to understand why that's happened and then what levers we can pull to make it happen. And it just struck me, looking at it from the demographics, that within a few years we're at a position where all of Canada's population growth is going to come from immigrants and Aboriginals. So largely where our standard of living, where our economic welfare goes, is largely how those people will fare in the marketplace. And there's been a lot of attention paid in recent years, which is a great thing, to those communities, but almost predominantly on adult issues, how they're being integrated in the workforce, settlement services. And I didn't really find there'd been any focus on the school-age children and what has been happening in the school system. How is the school system educating these people? Because while I do want to see an improvement of what's happening to the adults, I think the challenge and the opportunity rests in the next generation if we're going to succeed there. And then finally, where the role came in was sometimes just looking where no one else looks, because when we got the 2001 census, I think everybody was flabbergasted at how fast Canada had been urbanized. And I looked at it the other side. What does that mean for the rural depopulation? How do you educate people in the smaller communities where there's fewer and fewer people? There's only so far you can bus people, and are we able to adequately put them in? Because again, we know just as immigrants and Aboriginals, as adults, they're not faring as well in the marketplace as the other Canadians.
I want to remind the room that we do want your questions as well. I don't want to hog the guests. I get to do it every day. So please, as many of your questions as I can take, we would like to offer them. Veronica, can we have the conversation about how we meet future challenges without answering the question how we're doing today? Do you need to know what the state of our public system is right now?
Well, in each one of the themes that we've chosen, as Dawn said, there are going to be tremendous changes. We have actually done extremely well with the immigrant population, and the Canadian education system can be justly proud of how well we have done in integrating these young people and how well they fare in international tests. They do extremely well. The challenge, however, is that over the next few years, the number of visible minority children are going to grow, and clearly the number of Aboriginal children are going to grow. And traditionally, we have not done a very good job with those young people. So we really have to have some very serious conversations as a professional community, but also with the larger community about how we're going to go ahead in this situation. And the statistics are absolutely alarming. We have been successful in lowering the dropout rate in Canada so that it's less than 25%. And so we have 75% that are actually graduating. If you look at the Aboriginal community, then it's exactly the inverse. And so you have 75% that is dropping out. I mean, that has absolutely dire consequences for not only for the Western provinces, but for the whole of, we all own this. In terms of the rural depopulation issue and what we're going to do, not only in terms of closing of schools, but it is clear now that kids in rural communities in this country are not performing as well in literacy and numeracy as other young people. That is of huge concern to everybody.
Don, we recently saw studies, you may have done it actually, I apologize, talking about the economic prosperity of Canadian immigrants, which of course historically has been enormous, their potential and their output, and in the last 10 years has not been so. It's been stagnant growth for our new Canadians. Is that because we're failing them in some way, and is there a way to make it better for their children? Is there something we need to do today to improve that situation for the children that we're educating of new Canadians?
Yeah, that's really the perspective we're trying to take on it, because most of those surveys are looking at the economic welfare of the adults, typically when they've come. And of course that relationship has completely shifted, and I'm not always sure Canadians are aware of that, because up until about 1980, immigrants actually within 5 years of being in Canada used to earn more than Canadian-born, and that has all shifted, and now even after 15 years in the country, they only earn about 3/4. They have lower labor force participation rates, lower incomes, higher unemployment rates. And people have looked at that, and there's certainly some things going on, credit recognition and some of the settlement services, and to some degree that may be successful, but I think the real place is what happens to the next generation and to the children. And if we can give them a good education, maybe they will surpass what is happening to that adult generation. And similarly for Aboriginals, I get most of the statistics on looking at the labor force participation, unemployment rate is looking at the adult community. Very few people had looked at what happens from the school as it transits. And certainly one of the findings we did is just showing what a tall order it is for the education system, because even when the education outcomes in the case of immigrants were as good as the Canadian-born, they still had an inferior experience in the marketplace. They had higher unemployment rates and lower income. So there's a bigger job, I would say, in the education system now, given the changing face of the schoolroom than there has been historically.
We've got principals here, of course, who would have a very first-hand and personal view of some of these issues. Veronica, when we think about helping, by 2020, our economic growth is coming from new Canadians. That suggests that literally the face of the classroom changes. How do we balance teaching them to be Canadian, and whatever that means, good luck to you, and respecting who they are in all of their diversity, because they come from many different places? What's that balance?
Well, I think it has to do, first of all, with public policy and acknowledging the fact that our country is changing and that we're celebrating the changes and are going to embrace it, and that our public and fiscal policies are going to reflect those changes that are taking place. In terms of the educational system, clearly the hiring of new teachers, really we need to look at that, the kind of cultural sensitivity that needs to be developed in faculties of education. We need to look at that. And I think that we absolutely must engage our communities in as many ways as we possibly can, because they bring with them, those parents and the larger family brings with them the kind of understanding of how to work with children to make them successful that we can't begin to define as a system. So I think that the walls of the schools have to be absolutely permeable. It has to be seen as the heart and the soul of a community, and we have to regard it in a different kind of way. But the understanding is key. You mentioned the fact that we're going across the country, really testing out the data that exists and that comes about as a result of the study. We were in Edmonton a couple of months ago, and what we learned is that there is a very large Kurdish community there. Well, if you're sitting in Toronto, you don't think that there is a large Kurdish community in Edmonton. And these are teenagers who are literally illiterate. Why? Because they were raised in refugee camps. So they arrive in Canada, and being a 15, 16-year-old not being literate is particularly difficult. So we really need to rethink that. Secondly, there's a very large Somali population in Edmonton. But where did they come from? Rexdale. And so public policy really needs to reflect the fact that people are mobile, and our traditional understanding of how people settle in Canada has to be influenced by the data.
Dawn, what happens if we don't meet this challenge?
Well, I think first you have to answer it from the perspective of the individuals. They will continue to suffer economically, and of course that has a huge cost to them, but it has a broader society cost as well. With 100% of the population growth coming from immigrants and Aboriginals, that's what's going to determine the overall income level. I guess to use that dreaded economist word productivity, which I think is really what it's all about ultimately, that will actually continue to stagnate or possibly even go down at a time where we can least afford it, because we're going to have larger and larger numbers of senior people depending upon the working population. And that's the other element which intrigued me to look at that, because increasingly we're hearing talk about shortages of skilled labor. And I said, isn't that rather ironic, because we have these three pools of potentially available labor in Canada, and the immigrants, the Aboriginals, and the rural community are being far from fully engaged in the labor market. So we're keeping thinking we don't have enough workers, but then we have all kinds of potential workers that for a variety of reasons we're not using. And so I think that certainly could remove one potential obstacle to our growth, again, if we succeed. So it can go both ways. If we don't succeed, I think Canada is going to continue to stagnate or actually even recede economically. But if we do succeed, I think we can be tremendously successful. I'm so tired of hearing the answer that with aging population, immigration is going to be the answer. And I said, it could be. It's not the way we're on right now, and a lot has to change in order for that to be the answer.
And we haven't talked specifically about our Aboriginal population, the fastest growing population in Canada, among the most impoverished. Veronica, is it a different conversation than talking about how to educate an immigrant population? Does it have to be a different conversation?
It's interesting, you know. I would have said yes until 2 months ago. Having been in the community and asked people who work with their families, settlement workers, family services people, educators, what I have learned is that there are a lot more commonalities between the refugee population and the Aboriginal population than we have immediately recognized. And it has to do with culture and the opening of your institution and embracing what these families bring. So it's really rethinking the way that we reach out to our community. So maybe not so different.
This is a question from the room for Dawn. Asking the question, if immigration is our key to prosperity, are we promoting immigrants from the right places?
Well, yeah, first of all, we have a very bizarre immigration system. It's probably the only one in the world that's totally passive. So we don't actually promote anything. We don't brand Canada anywhere. We don't, you know, if we need 100 pipe fitters, we're not going around the world looking for pipe fitters. We just take whoever applies, and that's very unusual for other countries. Even though we do have a fair number of our immigrants in the skilled immigration, let's stick with my pipe fitter example. Suppose that a Russian pipe fitter applied today. He would be 600th in the waiting list, and somebody would check that he's actually filled out all the boxes, and then they would physically walk down into the archives and deposit it there, and it would stay there for 6 years. Now, meanwhile, that person could get employed 100 times over tomorrow, and 600,000 people who may be less employable would come in before that person. And again, other countries don't tend to run their immigration system that way. And it's wonderful to have the diversity we're having and the multiculturalism, but we do have to recognize that one of the difficulties has come as the sources of immigration have shifted. I mean, the reason they were economically successful in the past is they came from the United States and Western Europe. They knew English and French, and certainly if you look at the education outcomes that we were talking about, the education results for children who do have English and French were pretty good. The challenge came in the ones that don't. Even though, and I must say, this is the part I learned in the study, you get to learn learning your job, so do I do. Even the ones that didn't have English or French as a language when they came, after about 5 years, they did as well as the Canadian. So there again, the education offers some great hope.
But I learned from you, so I'm not sure how that works. Veronica, this one's not unrelated, which is a question about the specific immigrant groups and their performance, their scholastic performance. I mean, can we break it down to that level?
We can. And as a matter of fact, the Toronto District School Board has taken the audacious step of actually disaggregating the data in terms of performance. And I think that that is absolutely critical, not only the Toronto District School Board, but everywhere else.
Is that offensive to some?
Pardon me?
Is it offensive to some? To see that data?
Yes, it is offensive and scary. But at the end of the day, unless you have the data and you understand the data, you will never solve the problem. It's as simple as that. And I think that we must understand who is doing well in our system and who is not doing well in our system. And I think that even the term visible minorities, Indian kids do very well, Vietnamese kids don't do very well. Latin American kids from Chile and Argentina do well. Latin American kids from Ecuador and El Salvador don't do very well. So I think that we have to be a lot more sophisticated in terms of the way we look at the data. And data is powerful information for principals and for teachers and for school boards in terms of understanding what it is that we have to do. And when you do, you see your scores rise exponentially.
I suppose one of the questions that raises is if our education system has been thus far designed on an outcomes-based set of principles, are we talking now about shifting that a little bit and looking at the grist that's going into that mill?
Well, I think that I've always believed that we're outcomes-based or results-based. I think that education is all about adding value to all children. I think it has to do with understanding your client. It's other parts of our society are doing it. It's being more diagnostic, more analytical, more sophisticated in the way that we look at young people coming in and understanding them better. And really having the will to do what we know is right. Mm-hmm. And that is what we know is right is not treating everybody in the same way. Equitably, yes, but not treating them in the same way. And when we do that, we get tremendous results. When we don't, we get what Frank McKenna talks about in terms of the impact on the health of the nation, in terms of the criminal element, all those. I mean, when people are alienated, they resort to other kinds of behavior.
Don, a question from the room. Are there models within the G8? I guess we could even broaden it out if the questioner doesn't mind. But are there models in the world that are successful that we should emulate?
I don't think anybody. I think there's flaws in every system, and there's aspects maybe you could pick up. One of the ones that does actually brand their country and go out and do surveys of employers, what kind of worker do you need, and then actually seek them around the world, be Australia. But then as soon as I mention that, you're saying, oh, Australia, I mean, they have quite a bit of difficulty, and we saw a number of riots there in the last number of years. We're seeing difficulties. I mean, Europe has brought in immigrants to do the low-skilled work that they didn't want, and then the moment the unemployment rate rises, they're not so sure that they wanted them. So I think actually Canada needs to attract its own unique brand. And it's actually an opportune time to do that because, quite frankly, a lot of people don't want to go to the United States, and the United States is not too keen on having a lot of people that could be valuable additions to Canada.
But I do want to say that Canada does have a great system, and it is one that's emulated by other countries. I mean, we have educators coming from Germany. We always thought that the German and the French system were the best in the world. In fact, German and French educators are coming to Canada to understand how well we're doing it. We don't have riots in our streets. Not in Vancouver, not in Montreal, not in Toronto, not in Moncton, not in Halifax. Something is working. It's a matter now of understanding what the new situation is and, of course, continuing to learn with it.
This one is from an educator in the room. I teach at a college, and many recent Canadians don't speak English adequately, but we seem not to care about this. What are schools, especially, I guess, high schools, doing to address language issues? ESL, is that a program that is flourishing in Canadian high schools?
Well, absolutely. And clearly, as the number of immigrants who are non-English or French-speaking, there is a lot of money in the system, but more needs to be there. And quite frankly, there hasn't been enough money in the publicly funded system. And so, you take money from certain pots and put them into others. You have a leaking roof, you put money into that. But at the end of the day, the money that you invest in ESL, whether it's adult or it is young people, the ESL training for mothers is critical. So the money that you invest, the ROI is fantastic. I mean, there's no question that there is a financial rationale for investing and investing early.
But that's the point. We can get the data on the resources that are being put into language, and it's been very, very impressive. I mean, my whole take on this thing is basically the face of the classroom changed, and nobody really planned it out, and they left a lot of the schools to fend their own, and they've done an admirable job. But one of the things that they've done is shifted resources into teaching the languages, and I think that's absolutely the right response. But then you got to look at the opportunity cost.
Yes.
And you're always touched by some personal experience, and the school that my girls went to, I mean, virtually all the sports and the cultural and the art programs were left to languish while they went into language services, which is the right thing if you got one priority. But there are more than one priority here.
And there's another angle on that. This question comes from somebody wondering about the working poor trying to improve their lot, but often without the time to do it. So ESL may be available, but if you're working 2 jobs, how do you manage to improve your situation? Do our other social services support these kinds of efforts, or are they a little regionalized, separate?
Well, one of the things that we talk about in the report and will continue to talk about is the coordination of services for individuals and for families. So it's not only the individual. And clearly, ESL for adults in the workplace is a part of this solution, and I think that there are many employers across the country who have taken tremendous steps. Certainly, when you have a majority of employers being small business, it's a challenge of how you accommodate that. But there is, distance education. Community colleges have classes, 24/7. And I think, as Don has been saying, you really have to reflect in your institutional response what is happening in your community.
I guess an add-on question that this questioner also wanted to know whether the corporate world is doing enough, Don, and I'll put that in your direction. And is it the corporate world that should be doing it? That's my question.
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 aspects of the corporate world, and you often hear a lot of calls, and actually some businesses are anxious to play into this of going in and determining the curriculum and whatnot, and I'm very leery of that.
Bill Gates wants to do it.
Well, because what will happen is that we're short a certain type of worker right now, and the business will go in there and dictate a very specific type of training for that, and who knows, we might not need that type of worker. I mean, you do have to step back. You're training the mind more than anything else, and if you can train the mind, the person can adapt to some type of need. And businesses tend to be a little bit short-sighted of that. I do think there's a number of other aspects where the business community can help, and we are. If you look at Toronto in the terms of the programs like Career Bridge and Career Edge, which gives internships to highly qualified immigrants and fairly good success rate of getting them jobs after that, that's certainly a contribution the business community can make.
I want to ask both of you, and I'm just watching our time here before we run out of time, about outcomes. And I know you're in the process. You haven't made recommendations. But where do you think this takes you? Veronica, why don't you start? What kind of formal policy suggestions might come out of this?
Well, I think that we're going to have actually a very rich resource for policy recommendations. And those will be to government, it will be to the private and to the public sectors. So we will have, I suspect, recommendations about teacher training. We will certainly have recommendations about the silos that exist in government, often at the federal level, where immigration and HRSD policies absolutely need to talk to each other, and then, of course, at the provincial level. But we will certainly have a lot of good recommendations, and we will also have many, many examples of promising practices where it works, where schools and school boards and communities have rallied around a challenge and have really set the pace.
Thoughts, Don?
Well, I'll just build on that. I would have, in an ideal world 15 or even 20 years ago, somebody would have thought about all this and thought this is the nature of how the world and Canada is going to change because of our demographics, and we would have planned and resourced it properly. We didn't, but there's almost a beauty in that because the schools are all thrown basically on their own, sink or swim, and most of them have swam quite well, and so that gives us this rich body of best practices. And so we can bring up the standard across the country to the excellence that's been achieved in some areas of the country.
Let's talk for a second about government. You both have had some experience in it in various ways. So you probably have a better understanding than anybody of the complexities of engaging different governments. And in this case, provincial governments, in what we're talking about a national problem. How on earth do we create some kind of standardized or national vision when at the end of the day it's implemented provincially?
Well, what we're finding out is that there is a significant difference among the regions. And so if you're in Halifax, the issue that you're dealing with are Black Canadian youngsters who have been here for a very, very long time. If you are in Vancouver, for example, the challenge is changing from a Chinese to an Indian, so that has more cultural and religious issues. So I think that there can be a regional response even within the larger national vision. And I think it is quite possible to have a public policy in Canada that addresses these issues within an overarching understanding that if we address it, we will continue to be democratic, powerful, on the leading edge. And those values come through in all the conversations that we have, whether we're talking to Aboriginal families, refugee families, rural families. The values of Canadians don't change. How it all plays out may be different, but not the values and not the pride of really owning this and making it work.
Don?
Well, I may be naive, but even after 23 years in the government, I never lost hope. My hope is that it's so important that governments will work together, because we've seen the product of not working together. I mean, going back to Aboriginals, if the children are on reserve, the education's a federal responsibility. If they move off reserve, it's provincial. There's a huge crack that just so many of them work. That doesn't work. Hopefully they can just put aside their jurisdictional interests. And the same thing on immigration, which there is, and again, it's come fairly recently, but certainly on settlement services and whatnot, there's been a much greater degree of cooperation across the different levels of government. So that gives us the beginning of a model to build upon.
All right, we want to end here with some thoughts in a positive kind of a way, because we're an immigrant nation. It's one of our great strengths. It's easy to look at a problem like this and feel a little overwhelmed to consider that in 2020 our classroom will be dominated by people who aren't from Canada, who weren't born in Canada. What's the great thing about that? Why should we be thrilled about that?
I think that's great because we've done it. We have done it. We have a lot to be proud about. And the fact of the matter is that day in and day out, the kindergarten teachers, the principals, the superintendents, the families don't think about this in any kind of negative way. What they think about is, what is the preferred future for our children? And so I have seen it work. And I am absolutely, incurably optimistic. But if I weren't, I wouldn't be a teacher. I mean, that's what it's all about. As a teacher, you always hope for a better tomorrow for all your children. And it hasn't changed in all these decades. So,
Are economists incurable optimists?
Oh, I am anyhow. I just look at the potential here and how you can tap upon it. We've got a huge source of potential labor supply that can contribute not only their well-being, but the country's well-being. We know it's a globalized environment right now, and how better to tap that in to have people in Canada around the rest of the world. I mean, just one little anecdote. Manulife recently went into China, and the Chinese officer who was responsible for looking whether they would be accepted or not was a graduate of a Canadian university. That helped probably. And so there's tremendous positives whether the people stay in Canada or even go outside of Canada in terms of our trade linkages and of course just the value and the cultural diversity they bring to the country.
I think we have to leave it there for purposes of time. I'd like to thank you both for this, and I know many here look forward to the outcome at the end of your consultation process, and we appreciate your time here today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.